Hello. So, first off, I just want to start off by saying my day was good. Thank you for asking. No, I'm just kidding, but yeah, my day was good. So, I just, did some volunteering and yeah. Anyway, so I'm going to get to reading personality. I have class tomorrow morning, so I should be sleeping. So tonight we're going to read about individual differences in cerebral asymmetry. So cerebral asymmetry was the difference between your right brain and your left brain, or your left lobe. And your left lobe is associated with more feelings of happiness, and your right lobe is associated with more feelings of, I think, like disgust and negative feelings. Yeah. So individual differences in cerebral asymmetry, which is the difference between your left brain and your right brain. Okay. So, additional research has taken the association between cerebral asymmetry and emotion one step further. Most people typically have higher activation in one hemisphere than in the other. Even when in a relatively non-emotional resting state, however, which hemisphere displays the higher activity level is not the same for everyone. Some people tend to have higher activity in the left hemisphere when resting, whereas others tend to have more right hemisphere activity. Like other individual differences in cerebral asymmetry tend to be fairly stable over time. If you show a higher level of activity in one hemisphere over the other today, you will very likely show the same pattern when taking an electroencephalograph test next week or even next year. Moreover, these differences in cerebral asymmetry show up early in life. They are found in infants less than a year old and remain consistent throughout childhood. These findings suggest that children are born with these proclivities. Ooh, that's a good word. Proclivities. I never heard that word. These findings suggest that children are born with these proclivities, although it is also possible that experiences like stress and maltreatment could have an effect in some cases. These findings have led to another intriguing question. Because left and right hemisphere activity is associated with positive and negative moods, can we use differences in cerebral asymmetry to predict differences in emotion? The answer appears to be yes. Participants in one study were identified as having either left hemisphere or higher right hemisphere activity when resting. These individuals, when watched films designed to elicit certain emotions such as happiness or fear, as predicted, people with a higher level of left hemisphere activity were more responsive to the positive mood films, whereas participants with higher right hemisphere activity levels reacted more to the films that produced negative moods. So again, the left hemisphere, positive moods, and the right hemisphere is negative moods. Again, similar patterns can be found in infants. 10-month-old babies in one study were identified as having higher left hemisphere or higher right hemisphere activity when resting. The babies were then divided into those who cried and those who did not cry. When separated from their mothers, as expected, the criers tended to have higher right hemisphere activity, negative activity, whereas the non-criers had higher left hemisphere activity. Another study found that infants with higher left hemisphere activity were more likely than children with higher right hemisphere activity to interact with their mothers in a playful and relaxed way. How can we account for these findings? Initially, researchers explained the results in terms of thresholds for positive and negative mood. They speculated that people with higher right hemisphere activity require a less intense negative event to experience fear or sadness. A minor disappointment or a rude remark might be enough to push them over the threshold into a negative emotional state. On the other hand, people who generally have a higher level of left hemisphere activity may require a less intense positive event before they experience happiness. An enjoyable conversation or a favorite song on the radio might be enough to trigger pleasant emotions. However, subsequent research findings have caused psychologists to recast the relationship between cerebral asymmetry and emotions. Instead of looking at positive and negative emotions, psychologists now describe the differences in terms of approach and withdrawal tendencies. Studies find that left hemisphere activity is related to movement toward the source of the emotion, whereas right hemisphere activity is related to movement away. That's interesting. Thus, higher right hemisphere activity is associated with sadness because depression is essentially an effort to withdraw from whatever is causing the emotion. Very interesting. Higher left hemisphere activity is associated with joy because happiness draws us toward the source of the emotion. Consistent with this analysis, researchers find that anger is related to higher left hemisphere activity. Although anger is a negative emotion, like depression, angry people tend to approach or even attack the source of their distress. The demonstrated association between cerebral asymmetry and emotion has led researchers to yet another question. Do differences in hemispheric activity level play a role in the development of emotional disorders? Some research findings suggest that they may. Depressed participants in these studies show more right side activation than non-depressed participants. Other investigations find anxiety sufferers also have higher right side activation than non-anxious individuals. In one investigation, researchers examined electroencephalograph patterns in people who were currently not depressed but who had suffered from previous bouts of depression. These individuals tended to have less left hemispheric activity than a group of participants who had never suffered from depression. In other words, these previously depressed individuals may have a physiologically based vulnerability to bouts of depression. Finally, if cerebral asymmetry is a marker for vulnerability to emotional disorders, can we use electroencephalograph patterns to predict who is likely to suffer from these disorders in the future? Once again, the answer appears to be yes. One team of researchers measured cerebral asymmetry in a group of college students who had no history of emotional problems. The students were then interviewed every 4 months for the next 3 years to determine whether the student had experienced a significant episode of depression. As expected, students with higher right side activation were more likely to experience their first depressive episode during this time than those with higher left side activation. Measures of cerebral asymmetry have also been used to predict whether people who suffer from mood swings will develop bipolar disorder. Clearly, whether we experience any emotional disorder depends on many factors, including the kinds of situations we encounter. But it may be that some people are biologically wired to require fewer or less intense negative experiences than others before succumbing to feelings of depression or anxiety. And we're done with that. Whew, that was actually really good. Oh, that was really interesting. So pretty much it says that people are predisposed to using different lobes of their brain more or less. So people who use the left side tend to be happier, go towards feelings of happiness, and people who use their right side more are more likely to be depressed. This study shows. I mean, obviously I can't make a final conclusion, but yeah. Yay, thanks for watching this if you did. Bye.